Alright, so obviously this time we're now dealing with the German adaptations of the Dracula novel, which are in turn one is sort of a bit of both the interpretation of that novel and of this particular movie from 1922. This is another one of those videos I was a little sort of intimidated to do because it's the whole oh, we're just talking about things here and there, like last time we talked about De Palma or whatever, and the time before that, whatever the hell it was, like the Mothman video or something. And every now and then it comes down to talking about one of the most influential movies, like, not just in the horror genre, but of all time. And that just really set off this whole thing where, like, every single cliche you can possibly think of comes back to being birthed from this movie and stuff like that. And it's like, it's at a point now where it's like, what can you really say? Especially being a silent movie also. Obviously, I'm sure there are a number of things to say, but in regards to this sort of particular setup, it's a bit of an intimidating task when it comes along, but I will do my very best. And I will also say that it's worth noting about these two particular adaptations, going with the title Nosferatu, which is, it's definitely got something to it, these two, to where it's like, you look at this particular interpretation, because obviously there are going to be different variations that go off of what the novel does and what we saw in, like, the Bela Lugosi movie and stuff like that. But the thing here is that there's also something so much, like, it's more dark and twisted than this one. It's like, this original movie was so, like, just dark, and, like, kind of scary, that really any other variation of it after this had no choice, like, had no other direction to go, but a bit lighter and maybe a bit more fun with it, even if, the Bela Lugosi movie and ones that follow still do have, there are moments occasionally that really reach that horror peak, but overall, just by comparison, you can tell that there's something a whole lot darker going on with this particular story that's depicted in these two. And that's also mainly brought to life by the more, I struggle to say expressionless. It's definitely more downplayed. Like when you think of, you know, the character of Dracula or whatever, you think of what Bela Lugosi was doing, or what Christopher Lee was doing, or even what Gary Oldman was doing. Where it's like this really sort of big, sort of loud performance that, like, it's playing to the back of the room and all that. Whereas when you have Max Schreck and Klaus Kinski, you do see that there's, like, a much more sort of tortured way about it, but also mainly, the torture thing is a little bit there, but it's mostly like this almost entirely animalistic sort of way, where the appearance has been altered and all that. But obviously, Herzog and Kinski had a bit more that they could kind of, had a bit more room, with having, well, not being a silent movie, we actually get to hear his voice and how they went into that. Obviously the camera techniques are going to be a lot different, and they could make it feel a bit more bigger and epic. I was going to do, like, kind of a bouncing around thing, but we'll kind of go into, the Murnau movie and then sort of work our way. Herzog may find his way in and out of this, and then we'll come over here and all that. So the first thing you'll notice is I'm not exactly sure how many different versions or copies of the Murnau movie there are, but the two that come to mind in regards to, like, appearance are the one, obviously since it's in the public domain you can pretty much find it anywhere. I think you can find just about any of the versions on YouTube. But even on, like, its Wikipedia page, you can just watch it there. And on the Wikipedia page, they have the version that's just, like, the title cards and, you know, the dialogue and all that are these very sort of generic cards just on black with the white font, and then you have, it's just, like, straight up black and white, with nothing else to it. But then you have the prints that I think more people have seen, where we have the different colors and the tinting and all that. And the more untraditional cards, where when it's shown to us as far as progressing the story, it's written in, like, cursive, and it looks sort of like letters being written, which goes back to the original novel. But there's also, whenever somebody speaks, like, the card is different than it was when we're getting, like, a story progression card or whatever. But then there's also the thing where each color sort of has a different placement in what's going on, where we have, like, a lot of what we see is like that sort of brownish yellow, which seems to signify whether it be just an interior in general, just to differentiate, or that it's daytime and like the sun is out. But then you also have the blue, which I'm assuming signifies pretty much nighttime, even though sometimes it might be kind of hard to gauge because like with the way the cameras were back then, they couldn't actually like shoot at night. So obviously everything is like a daytime shot, and it's like you can tell by like the shadows and just looking at the ground that these were shot during the day, but the blue is intended to signify night. But and it can be a little confusing when we see Orlok just kind of walking around if you don't quite piece that together. But then there's also this the sort of purplish look that they have, where it seems like, I think the wide belief is it's basically sunrise and sunset. Just a sort of, like, in between day and night, more or less, you'll get that look. It is, the way it starts also is something that I thought was always a strength in just this story in general, like any Dracula adaptation. And that is the start of, obviously it's the Renfield character, but in this particular case, because they had to go against the whole, they were going up against the Stoker estate and all that, they decided to change the names. So we have Knock, which most of the other character names are like somewhat close, but then we just have Renfield becoming Knock, who is this dude that also sort of, like I said, just Renfield's that character that just sort of completely sets the tone for this story, and that's why I've always loved the portions of him. Like, I love the Lugosi that we get like his whole build-up, like he's the entire opening of the movie. And the way, just that sort of, like, there's, obviously we know where the movie is going, and that he's going to run into Orlok, but the thing here is that the second we see Knock, he just has, like, his own sort of startling appearance, that just this whole character is just such a great tone setter in any adaptation, so I'm always welcoming that. In this particular case also, there's something particularly, like, wild and manic, and once again almost animalistic about him to kind of go along with the Orlok that we see as well. Well, he's the only Orlok, everything else is Dracula, but as far as I know. There might be some lower remakes here and there that go with the same names, but for the most part, like, obviously Herzog, the whole sort of estate thing had, like, already, the copyright had already expired, so he was able to call them Dracula and Harker and all that. So, going on this, as I said, it's really interesting to just see all these cliches that we know now, just kind of in their very first natural state. Like when he goes into town and he goes into the tavern or whatever, and he just says that he's going to Count Orlok's house, and the way everybody like freezes and he gets all of the warnings. It's stuff that's more popular nowadays with werewolf movies, and there's even a moment where they like mistake a hyena for a werewolf, and they're talking about how there's definitely something sinister, and it just, like I said, just seeing like the birth of these things that it just becomes so synonymous with the genre. It's just one of the many aspects that's really engaging about this movie, but also, once we actually get there, and we meet him, and we get those shots that are just ingrained in our movie memories forever, of him just sort of coming out of the darkness, where we like see the form of his face first, and then his hands, and because he's always dressed in black, it's like only certain body parts are coming out of the darkness, the way it just looks like that. And it's also the way that he plays it, where obviously this isn't going to be showy from like an actor's standpoint, because the makeup's basically already doing that for him. So it's like, if it does feel very much like this sort of big character, and it's obviously this legendary character that it's an image that everybody recognizes and immediately associates with horror. I think if you go to like Wikipedia and you just go to the horror film section, the first thing you'll see is a picture of Count Orlok. And it's this thing where when you see just his appearance, or like his long fingers with the nails, it's like, to make the performance feel like it's big, all he has to do is like turn a certain way or like move his hand in a certain way, and it just, he hardly has to do much of anything except just remain almost totally still, and the effect is completely there. And you could say in his eyes too, but there's definitely something more about the movement, or the lack of movement, really. How most of the time it almost feels like he's just entirely standing still. And this does come through in a great way, but it also sort of makes you think about the idea of the whole silent movie thing, because this is where we can talk about sort of the difference in what Herzog was able to accomplish, given the different era that it was made in, where the infamous scene when he comes in to Harker's room, or Hutter's room, whichever one you're watching, and which are probably the most memorable scenes, at least for me, in both movies, particularly in Herzog's movie. But the thing here is that in Murnau's movie, he just sort of comes in and he just kind of has to stand still in the door frame, and we barely see how Hutter reacts, but it's its own sort of big moment here, the way, like, once again, he just sort of creeps out of the darkness, and then that's just its thing. But the thing is that silent movies aren't entirely silent, because they have a constant score through the whole thing. Every now and then you can come across a silent movie that either, maybe like there's one portion that won't have the score, or the score is like really, really low to where it's almost non-existent. And obviously with Nosferatu there's a bunch of different scores, because I think the original score is more or less lost, and like everything we hear up to this point is just sort of some sort of redo or just something else entirely. And then I think who was it that does the score for a lot of the Hammer movies? James Bernard, I think, did a particular score for it also. There's a college town about 35 minutes from here, and I actually had the chance once to see this with a live orchestra, and for one reason or another I didn't make it. But I have always sort of wanted to see it in that form, and how that was sort of its natural state also, was to actually have the orchestra like right there in front of you, and live. So that's something that hopefully that opportunity comes along, but it does feel like a rarity that's like long gone. But in the meantime, yeah, it's always accompanied with that score regardless. And the great thing that Herzog gets to do is do this in silence, interestingly enough, where he's updating a silent movie, and he's actually using the silence to his strengths in the way that the silent movie actually couldn't. It's crazy. So this particular scene, and this says a lot about Kinski's performance too, this is like one of a few scenes that I'll watch for Kinski, because I watch it and then I rewind it back like 4 or 5 times and just watch the different little details that are in this performance. And in this particular scene, when he comes in and he's creeping towards the bed, after we've seen him, and there's something else about seeing Bruno Ganz is playing Harker in this scene, and there's something about having his reaction in the shot, and like always in the shot. And then when when Dracula's like creeping up to the bed, and then Harker like reacts, it's so interesting to me how like Dracula does not even like bodily respond to this. He like never breaks his stride. He's just going very, very slowly in like one motion, like only just his little stride up to the bed is the only way he's moving. Everything, there's no individual movements in his body. And when Harker reacts like that in sort of a big way, there's nothing. There's not a slight flinch. He just does not break his stride at all. And that's a scene I can just watch over and over again, because it's just mind-blowing how he can do that. And how it's so... his performance itself is so sort of downplayed, but that's like the moment I really think of that just really exemplifies that in the biggest way. But I want to come back because I've got so much more to say about Kinski. But another thing that... obviously the visuals are also going to stand out. We talked about like the tinting and the stuff like that, and the way they shoot Orlok, especially when he's like coming out of dark places or whatever. But there's also just memorable shots here and there that have nothing to do with this, that are still sort of set a really creepy vibe, like when Ellen is on the beach, and it's like she's just basically missing Hutter and just waiting for him. But she's like surrounded by these eerie crosses, where it's almost like she's in some sort of weird cemetery on the edge of the earth or something. And Even in something that doesn't seem like it's supposed to be that unsettling, probably when it's at its most unsettling. So, um, but then you also have moments like when they really play with the whole, like the brownish yellow is day and the blue is night, and there are two moments at least that I can remember where it starts off as it starts off in the blue tint where it's just the night, and then somebody like lights a lamp, and it comes into that brownish yellow, and then the reverse happens when like the wind blows a candle out at one point. That stuff is really cool and something that's probably totally missing from the strictly black and white version. Um, so, but then you also have, as far as visuals go, like there's a, it's not exactly the word like you imagine it in the sense that you see it now, but they were technically considered montages that we see in this, where it's kind of the cutting back and forth between seeing Hutter and his wife and whatever Orlok is doing. And the thing here is that this was like, I don't know if it was like a brand new thing, but Murnau has been like credited to that for like really popularizing that and kind of showing it as like a starting point. Sort of like when we, a few years ago when we talked about Birth of a Nation and the sort of techniques that D.W. Griffith brought to life that have still lived on forever. You can see quite a bit of those in Murnau's work also. And that's just one example. And then of course, once we get to like the ship and pretty much every frame with Orlok in it, like obviously the stuff with like Hutter and his wife and all that, and even Nog may go sort of by the wayside in your memory, but the thing is like every single frame of Orlok after a while is pretty much in movie history, whether it be when he rises out of the coffin, but there's also the shot looking up at him, there's him carrying his coffins around, there's him at the window, there's him at Ellen's neck just before he's killed, there's him striking the pose as he dies in front of the window as the sun comes in. It's like I think I read somewhere he's only got like 9 minutes of screen time or something. And this is like a prime example of using that to its absolute fullest, where like every single time you're on screen, which is only like a small fraction of the movie, is just in movie history forever. Even like even when he's not physically in the shot, like when it's just the shadows on the wall, like going up the steps, that famous shot, the stuff like that just lives on forever, especially. And I think that says something too, where we're not even just talking about the horror genre anymore, we're just talking about movies in general. And the fact that this movie is, what, 4 or 5 years away from being 100, which is crazy. So, yeah, I think it was premiered in 22, but I think it didn't actually get seen widely till like 1929 or something. It was banned in a lot of places for being so scary and horrific and all that, but which you can imagine like back then. Every now and then there might be, like, especially today's audiences, there may be stuff that it's kind of hard to care about, like just the character of Hutter in general and how he basically comes off like an oblivious idiot most of the time, where it's like he's been bitten in his sleep and it's like, oh, these mosquitoes, and it's like when he's sitting across from Warlock and it's like he sees the picture of her for the first time and he's like, oh my god, your wife has such a beautiful neck, I'm buying the house next door to you. It's like, I mean, I know that's what he's there to do anyway, but this, the way it lines right up with, like, he signs the paper right after he says, your wife has a beautiful neck. It's like all the signs, but, and just his appearance in general, but, Hutter's just a very blissfully ignorant dude, I guess, so, and then it gets to an interesting point, where it might lose some people, but, it's sort of like this odd intermission shortly after the stuff on the ship happens, where we sort of get this symbolic stuff where it shows like the Venus flytrap, and then like I think Nox watching like a spider eat something that it's caught in its web, and it's like this sort of weird thing where it's just sort of showing us like how basically it's just nature's thing to have things eat other things, particularly of a lower kind, and how that's sort of not so subtly blending in with the vampire theme. So that's, and I think it's also interesting that it's so short-lived. Like, it's such a short scene, but it's just sort of And that doesn't really stray away from the visuals either. It's almost like documentary footage or something just thrown into it. Sort of similar to how Herzog used documentary footage for the bats in his movie, so there's always kind of something that, even if it's unintentional, there's almost like they're living these parallel lives here, but sort of in the same, doing the same things, just in different ways. And then, just this sort of interesting thing that gives the movie, like, this whole sort of supernatural feel by itself. Obviously, there was the whole legend that Max Schreck was actually a vampire, which is depicted in Shadow of the Vampire, where Malkovich plays Murnau, and Willem Dafoe played Max Schreck, getting an Oscar nomination. I believe the only person to get an Oscar nomination for playing a vampire, still. So, that's a title to have. But then there's also the whole thing about how the Stoker estate ordered the movie destroyed legally, and it's like a copy like got away, and it has since been duplicated and duplicated until we've reached it now. Now it's available on these really cheap DVDs that are like barely 10 cents. So cheap they even spelled Shrek's name wrong here. They forgot the C. And I really think this picture on the back is a picture of Kinski from Herzog's movie. I can't be too sure, but I think it is. But in the meantime, also, I wanted to mention real quick before we move on, just the idea that we talked about how he basically, this is basically the creation of the vampire movie, like, as we know it all the way up to today. And there's even some things that are just sort of like I said, it's just sort of a fate thing where we have, he had to change the ending of the book because he wanted to make sure to differentiate so that they really couldn't get on his case. So he came up with the idea to, if I remember correctly, the novel mentions that sunlight is like, it's harmful to them, but it's not like going to kill them. So Murnau threw in this idea that the sunlight just literally vaporizes him, and then that has since carried on through vampire lore forever since then. And then there's also the, like I said, just in general, the fact that it is like this sort of piece of history. It is a movie that's like, I mean, it's hard to say you get much enjoyment out of it. It sort of feels like, when you watch it now, it's like you're in like a film school session or something, but like I said, it's actually more so about the history, even the more you think about it, that really makes it scary, like how the whole, like I was talking about somehow a copy managed to escape, despite the fact that they were all supposed to be destroyed. It's like, it's weird watching a movie this creepy with all this, all these legends around it, and it's like, it's a movie that's not even supposed to exist anymore. And there's just something so, like, weird and supernatural about that, that adds a whole other layer to it. But yeah, it does, obviously, hold its place here. And like I said, it is, like, it sort of loses its initial impact when you sort of see it as a piece of movie history as opposed to the content of it specifically. But, even so, there are still those moments. The moments of him rising out of the coffin and looking out the window and stuff like that are probably always going to be at least a little creepy, no matter, even whenever after it turns 100, when that comes along. But, so, with that said, let's get on over to Herzog's movie, which does take a different approach. And obviously is coming from a place of respect, where he was saying that, I think Herzog was quoted as saying that Murnau's movie is the best German movie ever made. Like I said, no matter what genre, just ever. And then, what's worth noting also that this actually was shot in 2 different ways, and both are available on this DVD, where it's, it wasn't just that he shot it in German and then they dubbed it in English. They actually shot it twice. They shot it once in German, and then they do the same scenes in English. And I think I've only ever watched the German version just because I feel like it's... I mean, and I know it's not like, it's not as easy to dismiss the English language version if they actually shot it that way. It is very easy to dismiss it had they dubbed it, but they didn't. And I think there's just something more authentic about it being in German, and there's something more about the... Like I said, just the way... Because like I said, you don't really get that sort of vibe of it from a silent movie because you can't actually hear the dialogue, but so yeah, that's just the way I've always looked at it. But I do hear that there's probably there's a bit more relish in some of the lines in the English version, particularly with Renfield, who's got that, obviously, once again, that sort of giggly appearance that really just sort of sets the tone of where exactly we're going, even when he's just the employer sending him on his way, and it's, like I said, we didn't get the build-up that we did in the Lugosi movie, so just the little moments with him we see like that sort of build up, that sort of creepy terror feeling before we even get there. In these moments where it seems like we should feel safe because we're not even close to his big castle yet. So there's always kind of that feeling there. But the interesting thing here is the way that he really takes like the epic approach I was talking about, where when he does journey to the castle, and it feels like you get the big shots like him, you know, going by the waterfall, and we see all the landscapes, and it feels like this really sort of long journey. Like, most of the movie, once Dracula's introduced, feels incredibly fast-paced. Like, it just immediately sucks you in and just goes right through it. But this opening does feel, like, very long and very stretched out. This is definitely something I didn't appreciate the first time I saw it. But I really do now. And like I said, it just really gives it, like, if you want to talk about just a totally different feel while also telling the same story, that's a very ambitious way to go, and he, like, really pulled it off. And he did it without making the movie too long. It's still only, like, an hour 47. But that opening does feel the first 25 minutes or so feel very, very, sort of given that epic feel. So I do really appreciate that, especially much more with age. But then, eventually, we do get there, and then we really get into the great stuff when Kinski's introduced, and we see him, once again, those different shots of him coming out of the darkness. Now, obviously, this is 1979, so it's post The Exorcist. So it is, it does make you wonder how much of an inspiration he took from, like, from Friedkin with the famous shots of Pazuzu in The Exorcist, that look very similar to when we see Kinski's face in the darkness here. And once again, just adding like this whole other quality to it. There's still something like totally creepy about that in its own way, not in relation to The Exorcist. So that's really important to take note of as well. And like I said, you just get these really like, even if they feel recreated, there's still something so much more terrifying. And like I said, I don't know if it's because Nosferatu, the Murnau movie just feels like sort of like something that's been so looked at and studied and just seen in different imagery for so long in discussion of the horror genre that the recreations by Herzog feel not only so much like really their own thing, but there's just like a whole other level of creepiness to it. I don't know that it has anything to do with being in color, because it's still obviously mostly black and white in regards to the color of his skin and then his clothes in the background. It's still, like, there's nothing that particularly pops out of the screen in regards to that way, but there is something here that really stands out. It basically comes down to the fact that Kinski's Dracula is probably far and away the most photogenic vampire in movie history. Especially those scenes later on, like when he's just sort of running around the city, or that moment when he's like standing in front of the water, just like contemplating, and Renfield like comes up and bothers him. Like, he just has to stand in place in any location, and you can just feel the atmosphere just coming right out of him when he's just standing perfectly still. And that's just amazing. And I was talking about like how during the approaching the bed scene I can rewind and watch it over and over again and try to look for the details in his performance, because it's just so, I just can't get enough of it. There is a story about how, obviously we know from Gear the Wrath of God to Fitzcarraldo to the other two movies they made together, that Herzog and Kinski regularly wanted to kill each other, and this movie is no exception. I had read somewhere that Kinski like wanted to go really over the top, like we talked about. It was so great that they don't do. And then the story goes that basically Herzog would like provoke him and like get him pissed off, because he was known for like, when Kinski went on a tantrum, he really, really got bad, to the point that he'd get so riled up that when he was exhausted and couldn't do anything particularly over the top is when Herzog would shoot his scenes. I'm sure there's something in there that's a little true, but this performance feels, I mean, not to take away from anything Herzog might have done to get this performance out of him, but that it feels almost. I want to give Kinski a lot of credit because this performance feels a little too deliberately downplayed to be something like that, at least entirely. It definitely feels like there's so much more going on in this performance than something that simple. Was that he was just exhausted when he did the scenes. I really feel like there's more to it than that that he really brought to it. But I guess I guess you could ask Herzog nowadays, but it's hard to tell what kind of answer you get. But and yeah, another thing that Kinski got to do that, like I said, is just really exciting when you think about it. You may not think about it too much, but it's like you see the fact that Murnau's movie is silent, and you see that this character is in movie legends forever. So it's like when Kinski gets the job, it's like, what's this guy gonna sound like? Like, what is his voice gonna be? Because obviously you can't do the Lugosi thing or the Christopher Lee thing or whatever, because it's too. Yeah, just like I said, when you think about just the titles, it's clear that we're just in a totally different tone in these two things. And then it's like perfect. It's like you can't really imagine him sounding like anything other than what Kinski makes him sound like. And it just all comes together in this nice little perfect package. And then, like I was talking about, just the way it's so downplayed, where not only the voice, but just the way he just sort of sits there and breathes, too, is something that you wouldn't notice in the Murnau movie. Something that you have to hear. Like I said, it really helps to have silences and not just a constant score like you do in a silent movie. You can really relish in stuff like that and get to build on the character in ways like that. And then we get to just all the other different shots I was talking about, like also with him where we see him like carrying the coffins around. Whereas, like, when he's walking through the cemetery holding them, or when we see, like, his shadow on the stone building, he just looks like this tall in front of it. And it's like, when you see the imagery in this movie, it's like, I tried to explain another movie like this. I don't know how well it came through, but I'll try again. The imagery in Herzog's Nosferatu is sort of like when you're reading a novel, like Dracula, for instance. And you get the image, you have nothing to go on. Like, imagine, you're reading a novel that hasn't been adapted to anything ever, so the only thing you have visually is your own imagination as you're reading the words. And when you're doing that, if your imagination goes far enough, you can get some of this incredible imagery in your head that you could never imagine could be put to film. And there'll be cases like that where you imagine something so much more, you know, big and mystic or majestic or whatever. And when you see it put to screen, it's just never going to quite be what your imagination was. And I feel like this is a movie where it doesn't feel like you're watching, like, some sort of filmed adaptation. It feels like this was taken directly from somebody's imagination and their interpretation of it as they were reading the book, with no other possible look at what this could have been. It feels like it's just pulled straight from there and put onto a screen, like it's being projected straight from somebody's brain or something. And it's like how you even get to that point to shoot a movie like that is something to be desired by everybody, I think. Anybody that wants to go into movie making or is currently movie making, just to get to that point has to feel like such an accomplishment. So, and obviously in a story like this, it's just all the better because you've got so much of a rich atmosphere going on. You can do like the different sort of eerie things, and it's all, yes, it just works so well. And even going on, some of this stuff that just feels like just straight out of nightmares, even. Like, not just an imagination, but like, just in general, the rats. And how there's just the endless amount of them, and it feels like apocalyptic as, like, the streets are getting emptier, and there's even the scene where it's like the Last Supper-esque scene. There's just something so incredibly eerie that is just so perfectly captured. It almost defies description. Like, I don't really know. Like, I can just tell you what it is, and it's like, yes, that's that's the way to go. So, and of course, like Murnau, he also sort of decided to put his own twist on the ending, to kind of a bigger extent, with the whole what becomes of Van Helsing and Harker going off and giving us this really sort of bleak ending, and how this plague is not gonna be ending anytime soon. Which seems like nowadays that would seem a bit overplayed, the bleakness of that. But it just really, really works here, especially with just the constant bleak nature of it. Like, the opening when we see, like, the mummified bodies, it's like there was no hope going into this, not from the very start. So the bleakness fits perfectly, and I really do love that ending, especially that last shot. Like I said, just those wide shots in general to make it feel big. Like that whole, the moment when we see Dracula like just running across that courtyard or whatever, and it's just one shot by itself with like hardly any context. And it's like it just gives you this hopeless feel that he's like on the loose, and there's just something so eerie about that. As obviously the bodies keep dropping off, we do get the moment where we see like the long line of funerals and all the caskets, and it's like such a striking shot. It almost forgets to occur to you like how kind of darkly funny undertone this has. And yeah, they do kind of play with that darkly funny undertone here and there also, but not too much. It definitely mostly sticks with the bleak and the horrific, but in the best possible way. Like I said, in a way that you would have thought you could only see in your imagination. Herzog and Kinski together somehow managed to bring that to life in this really big way. So, and if this, as far as like comparing, like if, you know, you watch Murnau's movie and it feels like maybe you're in a film history class or you're studying it or whatever, and it does have those atmospheric touches that you can acknowledge and say like, oh, I can definitely see how that maybe worked back then, and oh, it's still kind of chill-inducing now. Herzog's movie, you just feel just in and out from beginning to end in various different ways. It like takes so many different emotions and just goes right into them, mostly using nothing more than visuals. And that is, like, yeah, it's definitely, to me, one of the great quintessential vampire movies, and, like I said, it's definitely something I'm more likely to revisit than Murnau's movie, but I do, you know, we do get the love and the placement in film history regardless, so yeah, so I think that's going to be it for this one. The next one we're going to go into, I think, puppets. So, it's not Puppet Master or anything, but, yeah, you'll see. So, and then after that, we're going to do a franchise, and then we'll have one more. So, we'll have to look forward to that. So, until that, that's it.